Hello and welcome to Media Snack, live from a very spring-like New York.
And greetings from London.
So today we're talking about the media director's role. We touch on this periodically, and we're fortunate that we have David, obviously, as an ex-media director at a number of big companies, so we can share your experience. And we work with media directors in many companies, global, regional, local, around the world. But we're thinking of the evolving role of the media director. Before, periodically, we kind of track the role of the media director because it's interesting to us, but it's really interesting actually how the roles evolve.
Yeah.
If you followed Media Snack for a while, actually, if you've been listening in the past to the Media Snack podcast, which we'll link to down below, number of interviews with media directors, notably Jerry D'Angelo, who's the VP of Media at Procter & Gamble, a very high-profile media director, and we touched on these similar kind of themes, which is the changing shape of the media director's role. Something that we study a lot. In our view, it seems to be going in one of two directions, and we're going to cover what those are. You might have seen the headline for this episode is called, "Are you a pancake or a pole or a tent pole?" as we'll come to explain. Because those are the two, perhaps, archetypes of media director. But we're going to make some suggestions that, if you find yourselves on either of those extremes, how you get control of the media director role, and then what you might be thinking to build that role for the future. As with all of our episodes, we have a lot of resources on this. If you go to idcomms.com/growth, you'll see our program there for media directors about really building that capability and building that role. And we'll touch on maybe some of those things as we go through. So let's start off. So you've been a media director a number of places, many years. What do we say? What's going on with the media director role these days?
Well, you're right. I mean, I was very fortunate to work for two, what I consider to be very pioneering businesses in Coca-Cola and Nike, that from a very early age understood the power of media within a marketing organization in its ability to influence the way that consumers engage with the brand, but also in the way that it can influence business direction. And the role that I played in both of those companies was fairly unsophisticated. I would take a marketing brief, and my job essentially would be to translate that into a media brief that I would then engage and hopefully inspire my media agency with. And then I would basically steward the process of planning and execution and kind of monitoring of that plan. And I loved it. I loved working for those companies, and they both taught me how important it was to be a believer in media as a growth engine. And you look at media directors' roles now, and it's completely different. It must be terrifying, quite frankly, because media has never been higher on the corporate agenda. The impact or the influence that media has in reality on business outcome comes from the CEO. It doesn't come just from the marketing director. It comes from the CEO. You combine that with the complexity of the media landscape and the language that we use and how confusing it must be, and the pressure on these big media directors. And there's a lot of very high profile, very highly credible media leaders that have gone into brand side roles, must be kind of enormous. And it's also fairly lonely. You're sitting there with a lot of pressure, with lots of different adjacent functions trying to kind of get your influence or take money, and you've got the CMO and your CEO putting pressure on you to deliver. It does feel very, very lonely, which is, I think, one of the reasons why many media directors embrace the opportunity to be part of the WFA, the ANA, ISBAR, because it provides them an environment where they can get to sort of speak to like-minded kind of people. So many businesses are investing in the chief media officer role or media director role, and the pressure has never been higher. Ultimately, though, the true test of a media director will be in his or her ability to lead the media function internally and ensure that it is an enabler of some form of business outcome. And when they get it right, then those stakeholders, those media leaders, can be so influential within a marketing organization.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said, because of the loneliness, nobody really kind of says it's a lonely role, but you can observe it can be quite an isolated role, particularly in those regional or global roles, right? Where you maybe don't have a big team around you. And I know that you were fortunate enough in your media director role that you had quite a lot of levers of budget. I mean, you were the budget holder. Many are not the budget holder, actually, and that creates a kind of an interesting dynamic for that role. The other thing that we hear quite often, just for some kind of context as well, is that, you know, if you're the media director, particularly if you're the global media director, like, where do you go from there? Because you're seen as a domain expert, often your business doesn't really want you to move out of that role. It's not natural kind of progression into some other marketing function. So it's quite rare that the media leader will then shift into other marketing roles. And we've got a few examples of those actually where they've been very successful. I think we might see more of that, you know, as media becomes more central to the marketing org. So it can not only feel somewhat isolated, but sometimes restricted in terms of just knowing where you go beyond that. Good. We might be having some internet issues. Apologies if the connection's bad. Might be me. Springtime's affecting all of us. Should we think about the implications?
Yes, let's.
Some of those. So, as we've talked about, you know, the media puts pressure on the media director, but it's a lot of money. So, historically, whilst the media director role may, you know, there's some frustration that it hasn't been seen as senior enough. It hasn't really been seen with a great kind of authority. That's changing. But often responsible for huge amounts of money, of the company's money. And, you know, without the authority and the seniority, but still the pressure and kind of that fiscal responsibility, I think maybe historically it's made some media directors a bit risk averse. It stifles bravery. You tend to kind of then, you get into a habit of just doing, we'll do the same as we did last time. So we're not kind of pushing the boundaries of what's possible, which is slightly ironic because the media marketplace is so fast and rapidly evolving, you know, and there may be for a lot of big brands, their media mix hasn't necessarily evolved to reflect consumer behavior. And that's a challenge because they're under huge scrutiny with this huge amount of budget. So there's this slight tension there. You mentioned it in the beginning as well, the fact that the media function now used to be quite isolated. We used to joke that the media director was the person at the end of the corridor when it comes to like the marketing department, because that was the person that just, you know, basically went and managed the agency to spend some money. And wasn't really brought into the marketing conversation often. Now, media is much more central to many marketing organizations. And because of that, it's now bumping up to a lot of adjacent functions. You could say grating up against some adjacent functions. So some are creating tension more than others, but lots of things as a media director, and Jerry talks about this a lot actually on the podcast. So if you get a chance, do listen to that. It's really interesting. But how you have to become, you're seen as or needed to be a specialist in so many more things now. CRM or analytics, e-commerce, retail partnerships. You know, you're supposed to be the expert on all platforms, and even in terms of content, particularly on digital content, we've got some media directors are taking more of a role over, you know, the dynamic content and things like that. Plus all these issues that you've got to deal with, like you know, hopefully you have forums in the trade associations to help you with, but relatively new phenomena like the need for verification and, you know, managing brand safety and ad fraud, and, you know, you have to be an expert in programmatic and building audiences and using data and all these things. And the role has evolved amazingly. So because of that, we see media directors' role changing shape in two ways, and we can almost put almost all media directors in one of two buckets. And maybe our job today is to try to help you out of one of those buckets, if that's at all possible. The first we call the pancakes, and we call the pancakes because in that example that I've just painted, you are spread so thin across so many adjacent functions. So we find that some media directors' roles are actually spreading out, which is kind of interesting. They're taking responsibility for CRM or e-commerce or performance, you know, which may have in the past, you know, what we might have called performance sometimes sat under e-commerce, might have been funded after a different part, might sit under technology or IT even, we've seen in some businesses. So taking on these additional scopes, which is good, and they're building a media domain, but they're then, as the director, you're spread very thinly over those things, and it's hard to then be strategic. In other cases, the reverse is happening. And so we call those the poles or the tent poles. And it's easy to kind of see the media director as a tent pole, which is, maybe one of the supports to the marketing organization, because it's a lot of money, but a tent pole in the sense that the marketing org really only goes to that person at key times. And they're not hugely integrated into adjacent functions. So they have a narrowing scope. And that's because, and we've seen this in many, many cases, maybe the analytics is taking over more performance, maybe, and they're left with sometimes just what they might call, the traditional paid media, which in some businesses, that's a risk because you get seen as the luxury player. You get seen as somebody who spends a lot of money on fancy advertising and Super Bowl spots and things like that. And that's a very limited, narrow view of media. So those are the two things. And if you're a media director, you may recognize that in your own role, that it's either spreading out thinner or it's actually becoming quite constricted, and you're having to defend your scope. We find in lots of places. So it's a huge test. One of the other complications is, as the media director, you've been typically responsible for the media agency relationship. Historically, that may have been seen as a kind of vendor management role. You were really outsourcing everything to the agency. As agencies have been under more scrutiny, as you mentioned, the CMO or CEO, CFO have taken more interest in media. There's more pressure on the media director to control more of that. And reporting like the ANA's transparency reporting in 2016 somewhat pitted the media director against their agency because they had to decide, which side of the argument they sat on, how much they were going to defend the agency or not. And that's been something that they've been wrestling with. So those we see as the two dynamics. Let's kind of talk about what marketers should be doing, because I think it often comes to a cultural challenge, right? Which is the age-old question of whether media is seen as an investment, which can lead you one way, or whether media is seen as a cost, which puts you under pressure in a very different way. So what would your advice be?
Well, it's interesting, and I like the definition because we see that in lots of media directors that we have as friends, that we talk to, that we work with, and to a degree, I can kind of sympathise with both of those categories, because there were elements of that even when I was a media director at Coke and Nike. But the most important guiding principle that you should have, I think, as a media director is that you've got to have influence. If you don't have influence, either over budgeting, decision making, or kind of agency management, then your administrative role. So having that kind of influence. So if you were a pancake, for example, if you're spread too thin, my recommendation would be just to prioritize, understand where the critical components of growth delivery are within your function, and focus on that. You can't do everything. If you're spread too thin, effectively you're going to do very little, very badly. So just focus, understand what your strengths and weaknesses are within your core media management capabilities. Focus on the areas that will drive the greatest influence and drive the greatest growth, and then focus on those, double down on those, and frankly, ignore everything else. You will begin to sort of see how your influence and your time and effort being invested in more selective ways will have a greater kind of impact. So that would be the first example. And on the pole analogy that you shared, there it's all about finding allies and breaking down silos and partnering up with adjacent functions. Again, if you are the enabler of growth, if you're the enabler of smarter media decision making as the guardian of media, then these adjacent functions should want to embrace your involvement in whatever kind of function. But you've got to build allies. You've got to break down silos. We talk to a lot of businesses that are encumbered by silos within their organization. Sometimes they're geographical silos. You've got a performance team that's based in a different country, let alone in a different building to you. But you have to break those down, and you have to champion that narrative of media being an investment, that getting media right will have a direct impact, a positive impact on a business outcome. Champion that narrative almost evangelically, and then just break down those silos, find allies, and then collaborate with adjacent functions and illustrate the value that you as a media leader, with all of your knowledge, can have on that particular KPI, on that particular adjacent business's KPIs. So those would be my kind of my recommendations. Focus on growth areas, and then make allies and collaborate in the knowledge that you as a media expert can add value, because you're an enabler of business growth.
Yeah, that's why it comes down culturally to this idea. You know, if you're a media director and you're working in an organization, which are probably still 50% are when they're candid with us, you know, that with their organization, even they don't, but their organization sees media budgets as a cost to the business.
Yeah.
You know, that's a narrative to try to change. And the way that we find to do that, I mentioned it up front, we have a toolkit which might be inspiring or helpful to you. If you go to idcoms.com/growth, that is all about how you try to reposition media as an investment in growth. It's a program in order to do that. Now, if you're lucky enough to work in a business where it's seen as an investment in growth already, then this will give you some idea about how to evolve. As many of our clients say, what's next? You know, we've got that narrative, I've got that support around me, I'm connecting with these adjacent functions, kind of what's the next? And that toolkit can help you understand that. We've got some good questions coming in, so I'm going to switch to those in just a second. But just to kind of recap very quickly, you know, the first part is to start by understanding and documenting your media organization. Whether you're in the pancake camp, whether you're a pole somewhere in between, there's probably another P that we could come up with. For those that maybe have got the kind of that balance right, you know, use those insights from that kind of assessment, and you see that in the toolkit, to build a business case. You really need to have a business case for your media organization. So clarify the role of media with those ambitions that David just mentioned and the KPIs. And then, you know, assess and benchmark yourself.
Yeah.
Again, find that at the URL I just mentioned. Benchmark yourself against others, because it's a lonely old role sometimes. It's very hard when you're inside the organization. We hear again and again to really know what other people are doing. What is best practice? What should I be focusing on? And that ability to connect with peers and benchmark your own org against others, you can see not only where yours got strengths, which is good, it's very reassuring. And that's a great message to take to your senior leadership. We're actually doing this quite well. But also it can highlight where there's some gaps, and you can learn how to close those gaps.
Yeah.
The final thing I would say is that, as we've said many times, strategy is deciding what not to do. So as a media director, your strategy for your media organization is also helping your stakeholders understand what you're not going to do. Because if you're a media director, you'll recognize this on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. You get asked lots of questions about where we're going with media. From, you know, are we in-housing? What capabilities do we need? What role does our agency play? Are we going to be in the Super Bowl? What do we do about the upfronts? Like, you've got so many kind of inbound questions. Everyone's interested. You've got to have a way of saying, we are not doing this right now. We're focusing on these 2 or 3 things this year, and our long-term roadmap is as follows. We find that's very, very helpful.
Yeah.
It starts to elevate the role, doesn't it, to a more strategic point.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one thing before we go to questions. One other thing that I would like to add is that as a media director within an organization, actually, you probably only spend about 40 or 50% of your time dealing with media. You know, kind of agency leaders are often baffled by this, because they just assume that they live and breathe media the whole time, as you do as in a media agency. But actually, as a media director, there's so many other things that you need to manage and handle that sit outside of your specific discipline, that perhaps only half of your time is dedicated to media. And so you've actually even got less time with which to prioritize and focus. So it's even more important to identify the things that you think will add the greatest value to your business, and, you know, use your agency partners in a way that can help compensate perhaps for the lack of time and ability that you have to try and do, you know, the many things that you need to do. So you just kind of, you know, use your allies on the agency side as well.
Yeah, dude. Speaking of which, let's get some of these questions up. Some really good kind of provocation. Jack, I think, is a PhD now. Are you, Jack? I'm sure you'll tell us. I think that's right. He says, do you think it's important or positive that stakeholders become multifaceted? And he's tapping into here. This has been a big kind of, this is somewhat a Ritson provoked debate recently about, should practitioners be rooted in established marketing principles? What do you think, David?
I think not really. I think that you have to first and foremost be a media expert, a media practitioner. You have to appreciate how to access influences from outside of your particular discipline. But first and foremost, you have to be operationally excellent at what you do. And that also is a pressure, because as you said, media is changing so quickly. Being on top of all of the trends and the themes and the disruptors in the marketplace forces you to constantly raise your own capabilities, constantly learn, improve your knowledge, so that you are enabling better decision making internally. And you can only really do that if you focus properly with both feet on the ground, in my opinion, on media. And there's still so much to learn, just within that discipline. That's how I would play it anyway.
Yeah, that's really good. Let's go to the second one, pint of stuff. The next one. This is because we use this language as well as the media directors maybe being the conductor to a team of specialists, and we see more and more that as an operating model internally. Is kind of frequently. The challenge there is they're not becoming a bunch of siloed specialists.
Absolutely.
You don't need to be the conductor of siloed specialists. That doesn't necessarily help with integration.
Yeah. And the way to address that, frankly, is you've got to be really smart and sophisticated in your operating model. When you've got lots of different agency partners that are providing specialist support in key areas, your operating model to allow all of these partners to work seamlessly together has got to be really sophisticated. But what I would say is, and where we found it highly effective in the past working with other advertisers, is that bringing together a currency of collaboration. So link a proportion of your agency's remuneration structure, link that to a way of their collaboration, to the way that they lean into collaboration. We call that a collaboration kind of currency. So if you can encourage collaboration through remuneration, through reward, then you're in a better position than perhaps if you don't.
Yeah, I've just been reminded. Pint of Stuff is Matt Birkby at the EA.
Matt,
who is a global media director. So thank you, Matt, for that. Apologies. Matt has his own YouTube channel, by the way, where he's I don't know what, he'd probably be offended if I call him a sneaker freak. I think that's what they call them. But he has a great channel about that.
He does.
Tell me whether that's right or not, Matt. Apologies. Baba, thank you for the support. Appreciate that. Lifelong education. We're still going. 193 episodes, many more to come. So it's good. I think we're kind of out of time. Jack says he is a PhD. I was right. It is hybrid talent. That's the thing. It's a tricky one, and it's a cliche that we call these kind of T-shaped people. But I think that's, I don't know what you call the media director. It feels a bit more complex than that. You have got to have that bridge across the marketing organization. So I'm sure, understanding, not just the principles of marketing, but the operations is really important. Being able to either go deep on certain things or know where to go for the answers is a key skill, I think.
Yeah, and for all of the challenges that perhaps we've talked about within the media director role now, if I was starting my career decades ago again, there would be no other position that I would want to be in than a media director in a progressive marketing-led organization than now, because that position is one of greatest influence, far more influence probably than I had even in those two wonderful companies that I used to work in. I would want to sit there because you're in the eye of the storm, and if you get it right, then you can make an enormous value contribution to your business.
Yeah, very good. Good, great episode. Thank you for your input. Go to idcomms.com/growth to find out more about that program. Might be interesting and helpful to you. Please subscribe to be updated with this kind of content if that's interesting to you. But thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Bye for now.